Okay. Kia ora tātou katoa. Welcome everyone to the public talk co-hosted by the National Center for Peace and Conflict Studies, the University of Otago, and Spark and Matsunaga Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution, the University of Hawaii. Welcome the NCPSS whanau. Welcome the participants joining from Dunedin and Hawaii. It is great to have you all here today. And before I introduce Dr. Salvador Santino Regilme, the speaker, let me open today's dialogue by sharing a short karakia, or a Maori blessing. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tunga, kia makina kina ki uta, kia matara tara ki tai, kia he ake ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hohu, tie moriora. Kia ora everyone. Again, I would like to thank you all for joining us. As a quick housekeeping announcement, today's talk will be facilitated in the webinar form. The speaker will deliver a presentation for the first half an hour, which will be followed by a question and answer session. So if you have any question or comments, please send me a message by using the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of the interface you will see. Now then, let me introduce our speaker. It's my honor to introduce Dr. Salvador Santino Regilme Jr. Dr. Regilme Jr. is a tenured university lecturer of international relations at the Institute for History at the University of Leiden. He has conducted extensive amount of research on human rights norms, global governance, and foreign aid. He holds a joint PhD in political science and North American studies from the Free University of Berlin. And prior to working in the Netherlands, he had worked at the Center for Global Cooperation Research in Duisburg, Germany, and the Department of Political Science at Northern Illinois University in the United States. And now, without further delay, I would like to invite the speaker to the podium. Salvador, whenever you're ready, please start.
Thank you so much, and good day to listeners from Otago and from Hawaii. Thank you so much to Dr. SungYong Lee for the opportunity to speak with you here virtually. So let me just share my PowerPoint presentation. If you can give me a few seconds here. Can you see the PowerPoint presentation?
Yes.
Okay.
We can see the presenter's view, Salvador. You'll have to swap displays at the top.
Okay, so how do I do that?
Up at the top left, you have intro, user slideshow, and the next one is swap displays.
Swap displays.
No, we can still see the presenter view.
Okay. I couldn't find. Is it stop share?
Salvador, I think at the top, on your left-hand side, at the top, there is the first icon shows end show. The next one is use slideshow, and the next one is swap displays. And if you can click it.
Okay, that I couldn't see, the swap display.
You could try to use slideshow as well. Maybe that is the right one.
Oh, here, okay. Swap displays.
Yep,
there we go.
Perfect.
That's perfect. Thank you.
This is perfect? Okay. Yeah, so I can only see my slides. I couldn't see anyone's faces here. But yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you about my forthcoming book. The title of the book is Aid Imperium, United States Foreign Policy and Human Rights in Post-Cold War Southeast Asia. So this book will come out this coming November. So it's part of the fall 2021 list of the university from the University of Michigan Press, particularly from its Pfizer Center for Emerging Democracies book series. this is actually a book that took me 10 years to write, starting from the initial research, field work, and then several rounds of revision. And this is a book that is close to my heart too, given my own personal lived experience with the countries involved in the case studies here. So let me start by providing you just a quick overview of what's the coverage of the talk. So first, I'll talk about the global reach of foreign aid and diplomacy. What exactly covers United States foreign aid? How big is US foreign aid apparatus? What are the different types of countries or actors that actually receive United States foreign aid? Second, after contextualizing what US foreign aid constitutes, I'll actually explain or introduce the core puzzle that animates this research project or this particular book, and also what is the core argument. Thirdly, I'll actually introduce the theoretical framework that I use in order for us to understand what actually links foreign aid, United States, post-Cold War United States foreign aid with physical integrity rights situation in recipient countries. The book covers at least 6 cases of US foreign aid with 2 of the Mutual Defense Treaty allies, state allies in Southeast Asia, particularly Thailand and the Philippines, but I'll only focus on one case here, which would be the United States foreign aid during the time of the war on terror in the global war on terror, as well as the war on terror in the Philippines under the Arroyo administration. So that's roughly around 2001 to 2009. And finally, I'll also provide some reflections on how to actually think about this theory, this interest convergence theory, as well as the implications from the case studies from Southeast Asia, in order for us to understand what it means when it comes to the possible ways of reforming or even perhaps transforming foreign aid politics when it comes to impacting the human rights situation in the global South. So the global reach of US foreign aid and diplomacy. So the United States is by far the largest single foreign donor government with more than 200 recipient countries. So when you say 200 recipient countries, we're talking about recipient countries that historically existed since 1946. So if you look into the United States AID, so the Agency for International Development Green Book. So it's a website, it's a comprehensive website that's hosted by the USAID and the State Department. You can see all those historically existing countries since the end of the Second World War until, I think, until 2016. The Trump administration wasn't really good in being transparent with how the foreign aid apparatus, how different foreign aid programs and disbursements were given, but the data are transparent for viewing and for research. And the United States foreign aid is perhaps the largest in the world when it is the largest state actor when it comes to giving out foreign aid or official finance, financial assistance to other countries. Yet this US foreign aid became under assault or was the subject of assault under the Trump administration. Now that we are in the era when Trump is no longer in the White House and the Biden-Harris administration is in power, Biden appointed Samantha Power for the USAID administrator position. And you can see here the attempt of the Biden administration to make foreign aid as a supposedly non-violent tool for diplomacy. And this is a way for Biden to signal to the international community or to other state actors that the United States is serious in using foreign aid as a tool of projecting its own interests and not only military violence. The appeal of liberal human rights discourses as well, especially when the Trump administration came into power, somehow lessened or was somehow diminished. It appears to be declining. And you can see here that this sense of distrust right? About the effectiveness of liberal democracy or liberal democracy plus market capitalism or democratic governance. All these types of discourses appears to be declining, especially when you look into the mainstream discourses in many countries worldwide in which illiberal and authoritarian politicians have gained power. Right. So you have the case of the Philippines, you have the case of Turkey, you have the case of Brazil, contemporary Brazil, and even here in Western Europe, even amongst EU member countries, you can see these kinds of illiberal and somehow authoritarian discourses emerging. In the case, for example, of Viktor Orban in Hungary. Some far-right politicians who actually try to undermine human rights discourses, the need for humanitarianism, the need for foreign aid. These politicians are also gaining power in many core countries here in Western Europe, or supposedly consolidated democracies, as many democratization scholars might call. Given this kind of global context, the core puzzle of the book is about the relationship between foreign aid and human rights. More often than not, specifically the liberal democracies in the global north, particularly the United States, the United States has always been committed in using human rights discourses to justify foreign aid as a form of intervention in the global south. This has been the case, especially starting since 1970s under the Carter administration, and in recent years, this actually emerged in varying forms. The Clinton administration somehow used this form of democratic peace discourse in which you use democracy in order to, you promote democracy in order to stimulate or to actually foster global peace. This was the kind of normative justification that was used in the 1990s. The same thing in the war on terror. You actually, the Bush administration used military violence, unfortunately, and that the justification for that was based on the idea that it could be used to stimulate democratic outcomes in partner countries. Hence, the puzzle of the book is quite simple, but I think it's very important, especially when we look back into the global war on terror, when the United States has spent billions of dollars in reconstruction, for example, in military violence in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and in many places worldwide, in Colombia, in Pakistan, or even the Philippines and Thailand. This foreign aid, the core question of the book core puzzle constitutes two constituent questions. So first, does foreign aid undermine human rights in recipient countries? And second, if so, how and under what set of conditions does it impact human rights outcomes, particularly physical integrity rights? I focus instead on physical integrity rights, or the freedom of the human person from extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, physical harassment, and torture. These kinds of patterns of state violence are not new in the post-Cold War. In fact, for example, during the Cold War in South America, desaparecidos, for example, is a term that's being used in order to refer to those people who disappeared or who were forcibly disappeared by the state because of their political opposition against some of the state policies. In the book, I use the term foreign strategic assistance or foreign strategic support rather than foreign aid. The reason why I use this term, because if you look into the economics, the sociological, but most especially in the economics literature about foreign aid, and even in international relations, the core analytic focus of foreign aid always look into the material element of foreign aid. How much is the foreign aid and what kind of outcome did it actually stimulate, for example, in recipient countries? The underlying argument or the underlying premise that I offered in the book, and explained this quite extensively in the book, is the idea that you cannot understand the outcome or the impacts or the effects of foreign aid without looking into the public discourses or the shared discourses and the shared purposes that donor and recipient governments, the political leaders as well as the political elites in both countries actually have about foreign aid. In other words, the material element of foreign aid is just one side of the coin. How much is it? Who is the recipient? The other side of the coin that is left, I would say, underexplained in the literature would be the shared discourses. What is the purpose of foreign aid there? Right. The core argument that I offer in the book is that donor and recipient governments' converging interests, together with the domestic legitimacy of the recipient government, shape the purposes of foreign aid programs and domestic policies. So essentially what I argue in the book, or what I demonstrate in the book, is that foreign aid is neither good nor bad for recipient countries. It's just that. It's foreign aid, it's an amount of money that you give. Or if it's military aid that we're talking about, these are particular weapons, but the question is, how are you going to use them? And this question of how are you going to use them, for which purpose, refer to the non-material element of foreign aid. And this non-material element, this ideational element, is something that is underexplained in the multidisciplinary foreign aid literature. And that's exactly the reason why how Aid Imperium seeks to intervene in this kind of scholarly debate. There are several contributions of the book, but I'd like to highlight some of them here for the purposes of the talk. First, as I mentioned before, I'd like to demonstrate the relationship between ideas and discourses vis-a-vis the material conditions of foreign aid, rather than just, looking at which one is more important. Is it idea or is it about the amount itself? I'll give you an example. So for instance, if you look into the USAID Green Book, there's an amount that is given for physical infrastructure. So building public infrastructure such as roads, for example, building roads, and let's say, money that is actually allocated for public buildings. Now, there's a big difference if you look into that amount depending on the time period. If you look at it at the amount during the time of the 1990s, in the immediate post-Cold War years, that amount was really for economic development, because that was the shared discourse of the Clinton administration and many recipient governments worldwide, that if it's declared as an economic aid program, particularly for public infrastructure, it was really about you build a road in order to stimulate economic development and easier trade within that particular region of the country. Whereas if you look into, at least in the cases that I look into, in many cases also outside of Southeast Asia, when it's declared as public infrastructure project during the global war on terror from 2001 to 2009, and of course one can argue we're still in the global war on terror, although in a different form, you can see that these kind of projects are, you build a public infrastructure, but it was really meant for militaristic purposes. A lot of these public infrastructure projects will be geared in those conflict-ridden countries, in that this particular road project will be in facilitating the effective operations, the military operations of the recipient government, but as well as the US military. So you can see that the difference here. If you just look into, it's actually non-military aid, it's actually about public infrastructure, without looking into the shared purposes, without looking into the overall context, then we miss the bigger aspect of the puzzle about foreign aid's impact. The second contribution of the book is about the political agency of Global South actors. If you look into the different policy literatures and even scholarly literature about foreign aid, or even if you just look into Twitter, and many people are talking about Afghanistan and United States foreign aid, United States intervention, many of them actually, many of the kind of discourses that we often hear undermine or dismiss the agency of Global South actors, as if Global South actors are passive and docile actors waiting to be transformed by an external intervention such as United States foreign aid. What I argue and what I highlight in the book is that, in fact, when we look into the effects of foreign aid, we have to look into the shared discourses as well as the political agency, not only of the donor government, those in the White House, in the USAID, its partner companies, for example, but also we have to look into the political elites. And when I say political elites, we're not only talking about those donor governments, but also the partner elites in the recipient countries. So, because in a lot of ways, these political elites in recipient countries also negotiate and chart their political trajectories with powerful actors in the global north. And this kind of contribution in the debate is something that is part of the global IR approach, that when we look into international relations, when we look into the study of when we study global politics, we shouldn't just assume that global south actors are passive actors. They actively shape their own political trajectory. And in a lot of ways, they try to strategically localize their interests in ways that are adaptive to the most powerful state actors. The third contribution here is that I'd like to offer a causal story that maps out the mechanisms that link US strategic assistance and physical integrity rights in recipient countries. A lot of literature often see a lot of these correlations between foreign aid and democratization, foreign aid and economic development, foreign aid and, for example, high on the economic condition or economic outcome in recipient countries. But more often than not, they don't really see what are these causal mechanisms that link this independent variable, foreign aid, to the outcome variable, which is physical integrity rights. And finally, a lot of the earlier generation of research on human rights in international relations in Southeast Asian region, but less so nowadays, would be the idea that it's a bit more a lot of the area studies literature tend to be atheoretical or somehow not really committed to providing theoretical contributions to the general literature on the region. Now, the question is, does foreign aid undermine human rights? And the question is, where does this puzzle come from? So as you can see here in this slide, the x-axis, so the scale 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So this is an aggregated data from the political terror scale in the USAID Green Book. So the political terror scale is one of the gold standards for cross-national data on human rights. So it measures in a particular country how pervasive are extrajudicial killings, practices of torture, and enforced disappearances. How pervasive are they, and how, and particularly on the part of state actors. So if you have a score of 5 or 4, we are referring to countries that are highly repressive countries or highly repressive governments. So if you receive a grade of 5, and this is starting from 1976 to 2016, we're referring to countries such as Zimbabwe or North Korea. If we are referring to a country such as 1, right, these are countries that tend to experience very rare occurrences of political murders, torture, and political imprisonment. And then, of course, you have the majority of the countries are somewhere between 2 and 3. And if you get a grade or a score of 3, those are countries that have rampant state-sanctioned extrajudicial killings and imprisonment of political dissidents. And what this graph shows is that these countries receive the highest amounts of US foreign assistance. Now, the question is, why is it, historically speaking, at least in the last 4 or 5 decades, those countries that receive the largest amounts of foreign aid from the United States tend to be brutally repressive, right? They might not be extreme, such as in the case of North Korea, for example, but you can see that a lot of them have historically repressive record when it comes to physical integrity rights. The second graph I'd like to show you would be the 2 country cases that I focus on the book. So US military and economic aid to the Philippines. Generally speaking, the United States, for example, poured in a lot of foreign aid during the Cold War. And this foreign aid, whether it was classified as military or economic, it was largely for militaristic purposes during the Cold War. And foreign aid dramatically sank in the 1990s, and it increased somehow in the late 1990s, and especially after 2000s in the case of the Philippines and Thailand. So this is an area graph that shows the total value of US economic and military aid to the Philippines from 1992 to 2010. And there are two shaded areas corresponding to military and economic aid to the Philippines from 1992 to 2010. In 1992, for example, so this was perhaps the last year of in the early 1990s, so until 1992, when you're still at the end of when the Cold War was about to end, the US government provided around 50 million US dollars worth of US aid, but that value sank eventually to less than 5 million US dollars in the 1990s, given that, and this remaining amount that you have both for the Philippines and Thailand in the 1990s was largely geared for non-militaristic outcomes. So specifically in fostering economic development, fostering democratization outcomes such as supporting civil society groups. So it was not really for militaristic purposes, given that you have that during the Cold War era. I also look into the local data in the case of the Philippines, but let me highlight here civilian deaths by state agents. So this is the data that we have from the Uppsala conflict data program. And what you can see here was that the number of civilian deaths caused by state actors or killed by state actors dramatically dipped or decreased in the 1990s. And there was a dramatic increase in the 2000s when the United States aid eventually came in again in the context of the global war on terror. In the case of Thailand, in 2003, the increase started. This was in the context of the war on drugs. But in the case of the Philippines, as early as 1999, before 9/11, there was already an increase. You have to remember that was just a short 2-year term period of the Estrada administration, and the Estrada administration already launched its own militaristic operations in Mindanao or in southern Philippines, and that short military operation during the Estrada administration already received a lot of US military aid, and of course that was sustained after the global war on terror. The next slide zooms into the case of the Philippines, and particularly on the approximate average number of political killings per year. And this data, as explained in the book, comes from the data from different non-government sources, civil society groups in the Philippines, particularly from Karapatan, which would be the coalition of human rights groups. What you can see here is that the average number of political killings per year dramatically increased during the Arroyo administration, thereby confirming that what we already know in the global data from the Uppsala conflict data program. This is from the Uppsala conflict data program itself, and it also reaffirms what we already know from local data sources, that in fact, the number of state-based violence deaths in the Philippines dramatically increased in the 2000s when the Philippine government received a lot of US aid, and this aid was really for militaristic operations. State-based violence deaths were less pervasive in the 1990s, wherein the focus of both the United States and the Ramos administration in the Philippines was really for economic development and democratization outcomes. Those outcomes were very different before the 1990s during the Cold War, wherein, for example, in 1991, you have around 1,500 declared or reported state-based violence deaths in the Philippines. This is the theory that I offer in the book. I argue that it's about interest convergence. The way that foreign aid will impact human rights outcomes depend on what could be the content, the substantive content of the shared discourses of foreign and of the donor and recipient governments. And I explained that there are several mechanisms here. The first mechanism is what I call a strategic localization. Strategic localization refers to the recipient government's discursive articulations of their political agendas, which aim to win the support of two major stakeholders. So the first is the domestic public, right? And also the donor country. The United States government is not there, shopping around different countries, asking them if you want foreign aid. prospective recipient governments, based on my fieldwork in Washington, D.C., for example, hire lobbying firms in Washington, D.C. in order to make the case in the U.S. Congress and amongst American politicians that they want foreign aid and for what purpose. And that process is what I call strategic localization, aiming to justify the receipt of foreign aid from the donor government. But also, recipient governments also need to justify why that aid is being used and for what purpose, right? And they need to justify that to their domestic public. The second mechanism would be the mechanism that I call as the interest convergence, wherein donor and recipient governments shared certain purposes, have a set of shared purposes when it comes to this foreign aid outcomes. During the Cold War, it was really for containing communism. It was highly militaristic, highly repressive. It was targeting not only armed rebels, but also political dissidents. This was also the case during the global war on terror, wherein the focus was really on militaristic policies, and the Arroyo administration and the Thaksin administration did not only target armed rebel groups, but also in many cases, for example, also killed political dissidents, unarmed political dissidents, including student activists, journalists, and other local politicians who might not be in the same boat with the incumbent administration at the time, right? The third mechanism that I offer in the book, and I provide illustrative examples, would be the mechanism that I call as resource mobilization. Resource mobilization refers to the idea that it's a material mechanism. It refers to the mobilization, or basically the allocation of foreign aid as well as the domestic resources of the recipient government to a particular set of agencies depending on the purpose of that aid. During the global war on terror, particularly the case of Thaksin in Thailand or in the Arroyo administration in the Philippines, foreign aid as well as domestic resources were largely reallocated to militaristic purposes. You have the police, you have the military, you have the intelligence agencies, and a lot of these agencies under the coercive apparatus of the recipient government were largely empowered. And because of this bolstering of resources within the coercive agencies, it actually activated two mechanisms. The first mechanism that I call here would be selective political repression. If you have a highly insecure recipient government, as it was in the case of the Thaksin and the Arroyo administrations in the 2000s, the abuses or the coercive agencies, so military and police actors, actually target unarmed political dissidents. So these are activists, sometimes lawyers, for example, or opposition members, and that contributed to the high number of physical integrity rights abuses, right? But what I argue is that that's not the only mechanism that generates human rights problems or human rights violations. You also have what I call as the erroneous coercive state practices. So when you say erroneous coercive state practices, this refers to what I call as collateral abuses, or those abuses in which the military and police might not have intended to kill or to disappear a particular person, but it was perhaps an outcome of mistaken identity. But what is important is that, normatively speaking, this is still a human rights violation. What I argue is that if you have an overall climate of counterterrorism and militarism, as it was during the global war on terror, the likelihood of erroneous coercive state practices would be very high. So the likelihood that they're happening would be very high. And what they argue is that even in the context of supposedly consolidated liberal democracies here in the global north, you have a lot of these erroneous coercive state practices, which I also explain in the book. So just to provide a preview, these are just some of the empirical cases that I actually talk about in the book. So they're divided into several chapters. But for the purposes of the book, I focus on the presentation, I focus on the war on terror in the Philippines from 2001 to 2009. In this case, 2001 and 2009, as well as in Thailand, there was a lot of foreign aid coming from the United States. The powerful and donor government strategic purpose for that was counterterrorism and militarism. But the recipient government, as it was in the case of Thaksin and Arroyo administrations, have very weak legitimacy. And in order to compensate for that weak legitimacy, in order for them to coup proof, or basically undermine the likelihood that they will be booted out from power, they have to increase domestic state repression. Together with the culture of impunity, this contributed to a highly repressive regime, and therefore contributing to pervasive human rights outcomes in recipient states. So I think I only have 5 minutes left. I'd like to just zoom into this mechanism. So let's go into the Arroyo Strong Republic. So as we all know, the Philippines is one of the mutual defense treaty allies of the United States in the Asia-Pacific region, including South Korea, for example, Japan, as well as Australia and New Zealand. The Philippines was a former colony of the United States. English and Filipino are the official languages. And during the Arroyo administration, Arroyo was a US-educated politician. It actively lobbied in Washington, D.C. to convince the U.S. government that terrorism in Southeast Asia is operationally linked to the Al-Qaeda terror network. Let me just highlight here some of the discourses of both Bush and Arroyo. So Arroyo said in 2002, and I quote, "The war on terrorism does not distinguish between ordinary terrorists and those espousing a political ideology. We will wage war against criminals, terrorists, drug addicts, kidnappers, etc., and those who terrorize factories that provide jobs," end quote. This was a blanket statement, and in fact, even if you were just an unarmed political dissident, you go out in the street and basically oppose the policies of the government, one can say, and within this kind of context and in all the patterns of discourses of the Arroyo administration, you can be targeted as a political dissident and therefore a target of the war on terror. In the case of Bush, the Bush government, the Bush administration also provided arbitrary discretion on the part of the recipient government, in the case of the Philippines, to discern who exactly are the opponents. And I quote Bush here, "I'm willing to listen to President Arroyo. I'm willing to work with her in any way that she wants to. We've had a discussion about Abu Sayyaf. She's got a clear vision about how to fight Abu Sayyaf, and let her speak for herself. But the Philippines are a great ally. They're close friends, and we will cooperate in any way she suggests in getting rid of Abu Sayyaf and other threats." And of course, on the part of the US, it turned a blind eye on the various types of human rights abuses, but it was happy enough to actually provide foreign aid and political support in the recipient government as long as the armed rebels were being targeted. And in that way, one can say that the interest convergence of donor and recipient government were not full. It was partial. They're happy enough to target armed rebels, but on the other hand, the recipient government was busy doing other things, particularly repressing also unarmed political dissidents. The second mechanism would refer to resource mobilization, and this refers to the influx of US counter-terror aid. And I quote Arroyo here, "When I first became president in 2001, I inherited a commitment of military assistance from the US of $1.9 million only. Today," and this was at around 2004, "today that American assistance to our military support is now $400 million. And still counting. In other words, from $1.8 million I sent under our presidency, our security relationship with the United States today is worth about $400 million and still counting, because we are now a major non-NATO ally of the US, and other assistance and priorities go with that," end quote. That is extremely important, because what you have to remember in the economics literature and foreign aid, but also in practice, foreign aid is a fungible resource, which means to say that it is somehow, compared to, for example, if you have domestic resource, so monies that were generated out of taxation, that money is usually accounted for with different types of public accountability mechanisms. Whereas if you have foreign aid, particularly in the context of the global war or during the Cold War, one can say if you're the recipient government, this foreign aid could be targeted for intelligence funds. And therefore, if you tag it as intelligence funds or funds for the military, it will not be subject to strict accountability mechanisms. The public wouldn't have any chance to see how that money will be spent in detail because of security reasons or confidential reasons, for example. Because of that, the top 3 biggest recipients of US aid during the time of Arroyo were the Philippine state security apparatus, the central intelligence services of both the military and the police, as well as the National Intelligence Coordinating Agency. State violence is part of what they call as neutralization campaign, which is actually a euphemism against all forms of communism and other armed Islamic rebellion. But what you have to remember here is that it's not only neutralizing or basically killing armed political dissidents, but that also includes many forms of political opposition. In the case of the United States, if you look into the record of the USAID Green Book, the United States provided a lot of economic aid. Many of them could be for certain humanitarian projects, but a lot of these humanitarian projects are subservient to the overall counter-terror mission. And I quote here that even, for example, civil engineering and humanitarian projects of US troops in the country were linked to US counterterrorism mission, and they were actually diverted to Southern Philippines. And there were a lot of intervening factors. The Arroyo administration was suffering from low levels of public support, and this low level of public support, low level of legitimacy contributed to her motivation, to her government's motivation to actually repress not only armed rebellion, but also many forms of political opposition. An example of selective political repression would be the Maguindanao massacre, which is what Time magazine called as the single worst attack on journalists ever recorded. Around 57 unarmed men and women were dead. 30 of them were journalists covering the filing of the candidacy of the Ampatuan clan in Mindanao. Maguindanao province had remained under the political control of this particular political clan, and this political family is linked to the Arroyo administration, one of the biggest supporters of the Arroyo administration in Mindanao. Based on the inspection of the Ampatuan clan's mansion after this massacre, they found out, and I quote, a big weapons cache consisting of light artillery and heavy infantry weapons, including commando weapons, explosives, and ammunitions, as well as military uniforms. And these kinds of ammunitions bear the mark of the United States Department of Defense arsenal. So the big question here is, how did the political clan have these kinds of weapons bearing the Department of Defense so far away from Manila? As my interest convergence theory dictates, this is a case of buying political loyalty. You have a recipient government receiving foreign aid from a donor government. This recipient government is highly insecure. It needs to buy the political loyalty of various types of constituencies. You buy the political loyalty of these local leaders in exchange for their support. And these local leaders might use these kinds of resources for repressing their own enemies, political enemies. And hence, the discovery of US military resources in Ampatuan's private residence demonstrate 2 findings. First, state killings were implemented to eliminate many forms of political opposition to the Arroyo administration. And secondly, state violence occurred in more prevalent ways where there were military operations. And you can see in the map here of the Philippines that the military operations, the number of civilian deaths, at least reported ones, and of course the larger could be much, much bigger than this, were largely concentrated in southern Philippines where armed Islamic rebellion are concentrated. So I'd like to finish my conclusions here because I think we're running out of time and I think we should have more time for discussion. The patterns that I discuss in the book, and I also actually mentioned here in the book quite extensively in the last chapter, the mechanisms that I presented were also present in the case of Colombia, also in the case of Pakistan. Pakistan has been one of the biggest recipients of US foreign aid since the US-led war on terror. And Pakistan was also largely responsible for, at least in the literature on the war on terror, Pakistan was largely responsible also for the many of the political activities of the Taliban in Afghanistan, for instance. Kenya in the African continent has also been one of the largest recipients of US strategic assistance, and they were also faced with a lot of security threats. And the Kenyan government also used US aid, counter-terror aid, not only to repress its own armed rebels, but also a lot of the political opposition members. What I highlight here in the book is that interactions between, when we look into the domestic outcomes in the global south, we shouldn't look at them as if they are out of the vacuum. A lot of the problems in the global south, such as poverty, supposedly economic underdevelopment, or even outcomes such as peace and conflict, should not be considered as purely local outcomes. In many ways, they are actually linked to the global system. And at least the story that I offer here would be part of that. If you're interested about foreign aid, for the references on foreign aid, I published several of them, but the book will be out this November from the University of Michigan Press. And it's also available for in ebook format, so you can also recommend it to your library. And I look forward to your questions and to your feedback. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Salvador, Santino, for this wonderful presentation. Actually, in the Netherlands, it's midnight, very, very early morning, and I'm very grateful that you actually stayed awake up until this time. Thank you so much. We have a couple of questions sent from the audience, and for those of you who have not been able to join the very first part of today's seminar, you can actually raise the questions and send any comments that you have by using the question and answer function at the bottom of the interface. So please feel free to use it. The first question that I got from here is from Kalika. So Kalika mentioned that really amazing presentation so far. Thank you, Salvador. I am curious about the UCDP programs data, which I had understood can only account for public records of state violence, considering that the state can sometimes use subversive means of violence that would hide the actual numbers of the civilian by the state. Can you say that those decreases are accurate? So it's more about your judgment of the validity of the data collected and examined by UCDP. Do you have any response to it?
Yeah, thanks for the feedback. So the UCDP, I would say, are reliable to the extent that they look into the public records of what were reported state violations. And that is why it needs to be complemented by local data. And that's what exactly I did in the book. I also look into the local human rights reports from the countries that I actually studied, which would be the Philippines and Thailand. And while the exact numbers might differ, but the patterns were the same. And that is, I think, is important for comparative study. So I would not really dwell into the exact numbers because at the end of the day, they're just indicative. But I think if the patterns match with the UCDP and with the local data, then that means to say that it demonstrates a certain type of reliability.
Thank you so much, Salvador. The next question is actually about what is being, you explained about the resource mobilization stage. So can you elaborate a little bit more on the US side of the response to those kind of the national actors attempt to for the resource mobilization? How do they normally respond? Do they normally accept because they just take care of those common interests that you said that there are some commonalities in interest and there are some discrepancies, and they just simply focus on those commonalities and disregard the others? Or because of this bureaucracy, maybe the US government may not be well aware of how those resources are being mobilized and utilized. Do you have any thoughts about, about US response to those kind of resource mobilization?
Yeah, so the U.S. government, when we look into and I think this also goes both into the leftist literature on United States empire, but also the more conventional types of analysis of U.S. foreign policy. The U.S. government is not a monolithic entity, right? So there are also battles within, let's say, the Bush administration. You have a State Department that is also very concentrated on the human rights outcomes of what the U.S. human rights outcomes as impacted by foreign aid, but also you have the Department of Defense, or you have the CIA, who are much more focused on the numbers of armed rebels being killed by the partner government. So these are two different, at least I'm just saying, these are the only two sets of agencies that we're talking about, and there's a lot more. You also have the inner circle of the presidential administration, right? In the case of in the case of the Philippines and the case of Thailand, for example, the focus was really about war on terror, militarism, right? So the foreign aid that they have, it's similar to what happened now, as we can see in Afghanistan. I'll give you a lot of money, spend it as much as you can on whatever you need to do. What is important, however, is that in the last years of the Arroyo administration, from around 2007, 2008, 2009, there were a large number of domestic pressures in the US, so largely borne by Filipino Americans, for example, and also the case of Thailand. But for the purposes of the discussion here, in the case of the Philippines, they actually pressured their own representative, who are Democrat representatives of California, to launch an inquiry against the human rights abuses of the Arroyo administration. Mm-hmm. That led to certain actions of the Bush administration, but it was only a reduction of $1 or $2 million, which in the grand scheme of things is nothing, but it's just a signal on the part of the Bush administration. We're concerned, but not so much.
Right. Thank you. This kind of dynamics more recent one, because when you compare the dynamics that before the 9/11, terrorist attack in 2001, and after that, do you see a big shift in the dynamics?
Yeah. So especially, my argument is that if you are, theoretically speaking, if we are in a military security crisis during the Cold War and also the global war on terror, governments are much more interested in militarism, and they tend to have a blind eye on human rights abuses, in many cases worldwide, right? And that was because as long as the governments remain committed to killing supposedly armed rebels.
Right. Thank you. By the way, Salvador Santino, just so that the audience can see your face better, why don't you just stop sharing your presentation file?
Stop share. Yeah, sorry. Okay.
No. I have another question from Alex here. By the way, Kalika, thank you. That's really helpful. Thank you. She said, Alex also raised a question. I will read it here. How does Chinese foreign aid output in the Philippines and Thailand compare to US foreign aid? Are the goals of the two countries' aid seen as significant different in the region? Do you have any comments on this?
So the current administration, so from 2016 to 2020, and also Thailand after the Thaksin administration, would be the time period that I don't cover in the book. For the purposes that it's for the purposes of comparison, they're already, I would assume, non-democratic outcomes, and they largely shifted their political loyalties away from the United States. So more so to China. And it doesn't really it doesn't look like a good way for comparative purposes. Chinese foreign aid, I published 2 pieces on Chinese foreign aid at the global, using global perspective, but we don't have reliable foreign aid data coming from China on how much they actually give to the Philippines and Thailand. What I do assume, however, is that a lot of these foreign aid disbursements are given surreptitiously and not directly on state coffers. There are unverified reports, for example, and I cannot confirm them, but they were reported in local media in the Philippines that, for example, the Duterte administration received political support from China during the elections in 2016. I do not know that, but this is something that they are floating. What we do know is that in the case of Thailand, when Thaksin was booted out in power and the succeeding administrations in Thailand, the Thai military and some political elites tend to be more pro-China, but we don't know how does that translate in terms of amounts. And it could not be via official channels, as what is usually the case with the US and other OECD donor countries.
Right. Thank you, Salvador. Because now, yeah, thank you so much. And Alex also, thank you. Because time is running out, probably if you have any burning question, we can have a time, set a time for another, just one more question. But otherwise, I would like to thank Salvador Santino for making his time to deliver his presentation. And so thank you. And it'll be great, for if you can give me a sign when the book is actually published so that I can send a reminder to the people who are interested in learning more about your research output. That'd be great. And then also, I would like to thank the e-conferencing team at the University of Otago, and also Jose Barzola at Matsunaga Institute, who had coordinated everything from the University of Hawaii side. And I would like to, meet you all, again in the future events of the center and Matsunaga Institute will co-host in the future. Right, so I would like to conclude today's talk. Once again, thank you so much, Dr. Regilme, for making yourself available for us. And all of you, I would like to all of you stay safe and healthy. See you next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.